The following is a project of our nonprofit newsroom. Support Midcoast Morning and local community-centered journalism today by signing up to be a monthly sustaining donor at chwy.ca/donate. It doesn't take much money to support local news.
Hello and welcome to Midcoast Morning, CHOY's current affairs show. I'm Laura McKenzie. Last week, the provincial government launched a new $300 million conservation tool to protect old-growth forests. The conservation financing mechanism will see $150 million coming from the province, with the remaining $150 million coming from a funding commitment of the BC Parks Foundation. The conservation financing will ensure that First Nations and the province can conserve critical habitats, better manage climate change, and further the government's work on protecting BC's lands and water. It will also implement the Old Growth Strategic Review, protecting some of BC's oldest trees. The BC Parks Foundation will team up with other philanthropic organizations, using a crowdsourcing approach to let all British Columbians contribute to the protection of the ecosystem. The $300 million will fund new conservation measures that are led or supported by First Nations. It will also be used for environmental protection measures, capacity building for First Nations, stewardship and guardian programs, and support of low-carbon economic opportunities. This has become one of BC's new ways to accelerate old growth protection, as first recommended in the Old Growth Strategic Review. It will join the new forest landscape plans of the province and will make clear objectives for long-term management of old growth, biodiversity, climate change, and wildfire risk. Minister of Water, Land and Resource Stewardship Nathan Cullen joins us today to talk about the conservation financing mechanism and what to expect following the announcement. Then we speak with the President and CEO of the Council of Forest Industries, Linda Cody, about her thoughts and how this new announcement could affect the forest industry. We also speak with Ken Wu, Executive Director of the Endangered Ecosystems Alliance, about what this funding could mean for saving old-growth forests and protecting other important habitats. Finally, we speak with Torrance Cost, National Campaign Director for the Wilderness Committee, to get his thoughts on the announcement. So with that, let's jump into it. Hello, Minister Cullen. Welcome to Midcoast Morning. Last week, we saw the provincial government announce the launch of the new $300 million conservation financing mechanism. Can you explain to us what the funding will be used for and what we can expect?
It's incredibly exciting. It's been a long time in the making. It's, as you say, a $300 million fund, $150 million coming from the BC government, $150 million coming from BC Parks Foundation, a private group that's been very successful at managing and raising money for conservation. What it'll enable over time is not just the protecting of more of BC's lands and waters. We have a goal in British Columbia of 30% of the land and water protected by 2030, which is kind of around the corner, which would be global leading. It also will allow us to hire guardians, work with First Nations on Indigenous-led protection efforts, and a whole suite of other activities that folks have been itching to do. And it's somewhat reminiscent of an agreement we made some years ago on the Great Bear Rainforest, setting up a fund that never depletes. It just exists over time. And every year we take off enough from the interest to be able to go and fund the conservation that British Columbians want. Okay,
and you already touched on this, but who is the government working with and who are your partners on this project?
Yeah, so the ultimate design will be done by a committee half made up of First Nations representative, co-chaired as well, to make sure that it's respecting rights and title and is in accordance with the Declaration Act of Indigenous People that we passed as law in BC. The BC Parks Foundation will steward the money in terms of keeping it well invested and then making sure that if there's funds coming out every year to support conservation. And it'll be locally driven. So when Indigenous-led conservation steps up and says, there's an area of old growth here, there's some marine protections that we're looking to do, we want to encourage it. And we know it's not free. It costs money to do conservation properly. You have to sometimes buy out tenures that existed before. You have to pay for guardian programs, science on the ground to make sure that the recovery, not just protection, but the recovery and rehabilitation of lands that have been damaged is possible, so that we're able to finally say to the next generation that we're going to leave the place better than we found it. And we've not been able to say that for some time now.
And after this announcement, What comes next?
Well, that guiding committee gets created. It starts to stipulate out, how people can apply, how the groups will move forward. But this is going towards a number of funds that we've stood up. We have a thing called the Watershed Security Fund that we've been running for years now. And that puts out millions of dollars every year. Indigenous partners, local conservation groups working together to restore watersheds, to build them back so that when drought comes or floods, as we've seen often in BC, we have watersheds that are more resilient, that salmon are able to return. And we know we're facing the dual impacts of climate change as well as the loss of biodiversity in this province. And so these are the kinds of initiatives that we know make a difference. And it gives people a sense of hope as well, which we desperately need in these days.
What other efforts is the provincial government making to protect old growth?
Yeah, we have specific old growth protection. So we've set aside, I think it's now 2.4 million hectares of old growth across the province. In addition to that, there is specified old growth for caribou herds that are at risk, spotted owl. These are species in their specific locations that are at risk. So we set aside 280,000 hectares of spotted owl old growth habitat. That is something we did with the federal government and First Nations. We have a whole breeding program for spotted owls, first of its kind in the world, because they were in danger of becoming extinct, at least in BC. And so this is the kind of efforts that we got to keep doing, because we know we've had a real impact on this place, but we also know that it's possible to recover and rehabilitate the land and reintroduce species and make sure that the place is more vibrant.
And what do you say to your critics who say you're just not doing enough to protect old growth?
Oh, I always say there's more to do. I mean, these are iconic trees. These are iconic forests that we knew when we took office in 2017 were in real risk of being lost, that the logging that had gone under previous governments was just unabated. They just kept issuing more and more permits. We knew we were running out of the most vital old growth, the coastal temperate rainforests that are so vital. And we knew that projects like the Great Bear Rainforest, the conservation financing that we just talked about, is the way forward for communities. So we take a community-centered approach on this. That if you have laws that are based, as our laws are now, based in rights and title here in BC, it's not solely up to the federal or provincial government to come in and dictate what happens on the land base. We have to work with the rights and title holders. We have to work with local communities and say, okay, we have to change our forestry practices across the board. We have to set far more old growth into protection, which we have. And the amount of old growth that's being taken out now is historically low. I think it may be the lowest ever. And we know there's more to do. So critics will continue to demand more and ask for more. And I frankly encourage it, because there's always more to do.
And speaking of logging, how will this affect the forest industry in the province?
Yeah, so forest industry has been probably the last 25 years has been in a real challenge. A couple of major factors. One, pine beetle and spruce beetle have been devastating massive tracts of forest. We saw with the fires, not just last summer, but the summers before. 14 times more forest burned just last summer than we log in an entire year in BC. So it gives you some context of what's happening in the land base and what's happening for forest companies who are trying to harvest wood, especially wood that they've already planted some generations back. So we know there's real pressures on. We've added a number of funds to the forest sector so that they can change practice, add far more value added. And we've been seeing some plants open up that were either dormant or didn't exist at all before, doing that kind of value added work that we know the world wants. There are new wood products for sure, and biofuels and whatnot that the world is looking for. But BC has been largely married to one kind of forest industry, mostly 2x4 and pulp and paper. And we know there's a lot more to do.
Thank you for your time.
Of course, anytime.
That was Minister of Land, Water and Resource Stewardship, Nathan Cullen, on the new conservation financing mechanism. Now we are going to hear from President and CEO of the Council of Forest Industries, Linda Cody, about her thoughts and how this new conservation financing could affect the forest industry. Hello, Linda. Welcome to Midcoast Morning. The provincial government announced the launch of the new $300 million conservation financing mechanism. What were your thoughts on it?
Well, from a forest industry perspective, we think it's a very interesting development conservation financing isn't a new idea or mechanism. It's a tool that's been around for a long time. But for the most part, it's usually been applied on private lands. And what's interesting and new about this approach, and we still don't know very much about it, but we'll hear more about it in the coming months. But what's interesting about this approach is that it's going to apply to provincial lands that are subject to Aboriginal title. And First Nations and the First Nations involved are going to have a leadership role around the allocation of the funds. So it really is forging some new ground and looking at conservation from an Indigenous perspective and integrating that into First Nations land use planning and local land use planning. So, it's new. It's going someplace where conservation financing hasn't gone before. So I think there's going to be a lot of interest in seeing what the next elements in this rollout involve.
And right now, is there any concerns on how this might affect the forest industry in BC?
Well, the industry right now has been going through a lot of uncertainty, market conditions, and as part of this announcement, the government referenced the old growth deferrals. So over 2 million hectares of areas have been logging has been deferred while planning and for old growth and land use planning gets underway. So, I think if this mechanism could help bring some clarity to that and relieve some of that uncertainty, I think that would be very good for the communities of workers and companies that depend upon sustainable forest management here in BC. So it could be quite helpful moving forward if it reduces some of the uncertainty that's out there right now.
And will you be working with the government on this?
Oh, yes. I'm sure that forest companies across BC, they'll be working with their local communities, their First Nations communities, the government, other groups that are interested, investors. I think there'll be a lot of interest in how this new tool can be applied and where we can take it in BC. And it's another sign of innovation in BC around sustainable forest management and conservation. And with the fires this summer, will this mechanism or will some of this funding be available at the local community level to help with fuel removal and spacing and some of the mitigation measures that are going to be needed to protect forests, whether they're in parks or whether they're on the managed forest landscape. We're going to need to protect them more from the impacts of wildfires. So perhaps this is a fund that can help with that as well. Nobody knows yet, but I'm sure a lot of people will be interested in engaging on this.
And what are you sort of looking forward to with this new mechanism?
Well, first and foremost, learning more about it, how it's going to be applied, and what the opportunities might be to use it. As I say, both in terms of protected areas, but also managing for conservation on the landscape as a whole. So, there's a lot of management for conservation that occurs even within timber harvesting areas. So is there an opportunity to apply this tool there for old growth management areas or cultural areas or biodiversity set-asides? What's going to count in terms of, BC's commitment to 30 by 30 and how we're going to get there. So there's a lot of work to be done on this, but certainly is an interesting opportunity, and we look forward to learning more about it and working with the groups involved.
Within the forest industry, what are they currently doing right now to protect old growth?
Well, the province has launched a 14-point strategy, right, for old growth protection. It's the Old Growth Strategic Review that was conducted a couple of years ago, and this is where the old growth deferral areas were one of the elements. But there's 13 other elements in that strategy, and the province will be releasing an action plan against or for that strategy in the next little while. They've been consulting on it for the past year. So companies have been working with the province and First Nations and local communities and other groups on that strategy. So there'll be more to come on that as well. But it's a very comprehensive strategy that everyone hopes will be credible locally and globally.
Thank you for your time. That was Linda Cody, President and CEO of the Council of Forest Industries.
Midcoast Morning is made possible by the Community Radio Fund of Canada's Radio Meters program and listeners like you. Support Midcoast Morning and CHOI's nonprofit newsroom today by becoming a sustaining donor at choi.ca/donate. Local news can't survive without your support. Another way to help us out is to share this show with your friends and tell them why they should support us. Finally, if you're listening to the podcast edition of Midcoast Morning, go and give us a positive review on Apple Podcasts or whatever podcast feed you use. It helps people find us.
I had a chance to speak with Ken Wu, Executive Director of the Endangered Ecosystem Alliance, about the conservation financing mechanism and get his thoughts on how this could help protect BC's old-growth forests. Here's the interview. Hello, Ken. Welcome to Midcoast Morning. Last week, we saw the provincial government announce the launch of the new $300 million conservation financing mechanism to protect old-growth forests. What is your response to this announcement?
Well, the conservation financing mechanism is a big game changer to be able to establish on-the-ground protected area in British Columbia. A lot of people think that the provincial government can unilaterally just save old-growth forests and establish protected areas in BC. That hasn't been the case for at least about 15 or more years. First Nations whose unceded territories old-growth forests are on have to support consent to legislated protected areas, including for old growth. And so First Nations really are in the driver's seat for old growth and protected areas designations in their own unceded territories. But the province is culpable to create a vehicle that is the policies and the funding, which is now just being set up to enable First Nations to drive to where we all need to go, which is the protection of endangered ecosystems and old growth forests. So this $300 million is a big deal.
And so the Endangered Ecosystem Alliance has been, since 2017, been calling for the provincial government to support conservation funding to protect old growth. Can you speak to that work and what was involved with it?
Back in 2017, I was the executive director of Ancient Forest Alliance, but we knew that when the BC NDP came to power, we had a chance to bring forward a whole new set of policies that they might have been receptive to. Now, it's been a struggle, but we're getting there. And so back then, we defined in the document of policy recommendations I made to the BC NDP government, the new government at the time, we defined that conservation financing was a critically important feature on how essentially the fuel for new protected areas that the province had to commit to. And at the same time, the federal government has been moving forward to fund Indigenous protected and conserved areas. So then in 2020, I launched the campaign with the Union of BC Indian Chiefs and with many different First Nations and conservation group allies to call for the province to conjoin federal funding for conservation financing to support Indigenous protected areas in old growth. And now they're moving to do that very shortly with federal funding, but they've just announced a major provincial funding stream with philanthropic dollars, the $300 million announced last week.
And what do you hope to see from the new funding?
Well, we need to still ensure that the funding is tied to ecosystem-based targets. This is the critical feature now. Ecosystem-based targets means that not only do you have a total land protection target, which in British Columbia is 30% of the province by 2030, but every ecosystem, all the different types of forests, including making forest productivity distinctions between productive old growth with big trees and low productivity with small trees like in the subalpine or in bogs, making targets based on science and traditional ecological knowledge for each of those ecosystems is key. Because if you don't have ecosystem-based targets, then you're going to see a major protection of alpine and subalpine landscapes, again, with no trees or small trees. And these protected areas will continue to skirt around or evade and exclude protection of the big timber in the valley bottoms and lowlands, which will still get cut. So basically, without ecosystem-based targets, it's sort of like sending in the fire brigade to hose down all the houses that are not burning while the fires that are raging on other houses are ignored. Ecosystem-based targets means that you aim protection correctly. So we need to link conservation financing to ecosystem-based targets so that we get the biggest and best old-growth forests protected. That's the on-the-ground result we'd like to see, along with support for Indigenous sustainable economic development to diversify the economies in First Nations communities based on greener, conservation-based economies. Instead of currently, there's a high level of dependency on old-growth logging jobs and revenues in many, many First Nations communities across British Columbia. And that is the fundamental barrier. The main barrier to protecting old growth forests is the economic dependency of First Nations right now on old growth logging jobs and revenues. Conservation financing provides alternative funding for tourism and clean energy and sustainable seafood, wild mushroom harvesting, carbon offsets, and other kind of industries to move First Nations away from that dependency on old growth logging.
And sort of going off of that, from your perspective, why is saving old growth so important?
Well, these are some of the greatest forests anywhere on the planet. I mean, old growth forests have trees as wide as living rooms, as tall as downtown skyscrapers. The trees can live to over 2,000 years old, and they're vital to support endangered species. They're vital for providing clean water, for drinking water for communities like Vancouver and Victoria, for example, and for wild salmon, for Indigenous cultures that evolved with old growth forests over millennia, and for storing massive amounts of carbon. And also, it's shown that when you save old growth forests and also establish protected areas, it boosts the economy. Contrary to the old tired narrative that saving nature destroys the economy, it's the opposite. The research shows that where you get the protected area system, you get not only tourism and recreation, but enhanced real estate values. It attracts skilled labor, so you get a whole plethora of different industries with the skilled labor. It sustains the habitat and water quality for commercial and recreational fisheries. There's a whole diversification of industries that are supported by and attracted to the communities near protected areas. So it's a better deal economically to save old growth forests. The last 20% that remains of these productive old growth forests. They've already shaved off the other 80%, including more like 92% of the really big treed valley bottoms. The highest best use economically, not only environmentally, is to keep them standing.
In your opinion, will this impact communities that depend on forestry in a significant way?
It will diversify rural economies and First Nations economies and attract a whole diversity of industries. Forestry can and should continue, and the BC government needs to have a whole integrated forestry strategy to ensure the shift to second growth wood manufacturing for a much smarter, value-added, engineered wood products industry, so that they need to basically ramp up their ability to diversify and increase value added in the second growth forestry sector. That way you can keep the forestry jobs, even increase them, while saving the remaining old growth for its highest best use for ecosystems, for the climate, for our health and well-being, and for a much diversified, resilient, and ultimately prosperous economy.
Would you say this funding is a victory, or is there more to be done?
This is a victory. It's a big step forward, but there is also more to be done. We need to ensure ecosystem-based protection targets, ensure that the government upholds protected areas standards and permanency. We're worried they might try to erode some of those. There's a whole lot of pieces we need to put together, but this is an indispensable big piece. It's a great move forward, and Premier Eby should be thanked for the conservation financing mechanism. And I believe there's more funding coming through provincial federal funding agreements for nature protection in BC that we'll hear about quite soon.
Do you have any other thoughts on this subject?
Well, I'd just like to say, give credit where credit's due. It's important that when governments do the right thing, that you give credit. Premier Eby has now implemented a conservation financing mechanism. The $300 million will grow, I believe, into the billions over the next several years to fuel or power the expansion of the protected areas system by supporting First Nations. He has committed to doubling the protected areas over the next 7 years from 15% now to 30%. And he has said that they're going to target protection for biodiverse areas, potentially bringing in ecosystem-based targets through a new policy called the Biodiversity and Ecosystem Health Framework. He's moving things in the right direction, but there's a whole lot of gaps and loopholes that we still got to close. But it's going there, and we just got to keep working at it.
Ken, thank you so much for your time.
Hey, thank you so much, Lauren.
That was Ken Wu, Executive Director of the Endangered Ecosystem Alliance, giving us his perspective on the conservation financing mechanism. Now we are going to hear from Torrance Cost from the Wilderness Committee about his thoughts on the announcement. Hello and welcome to Midcast Morning. To start us off, can you tell me about the new conservation financing mechanism that was announced last week?
We were thrilled. $300 million is a great start to begin to remove some of the barriers to conservation, and particularly old growth conservation in BC. Setting aside forests and choosing to protect them over logging them, it carries costs, and those are disproportionately borne by communities and First Nations. And so seeing this fund come together to offset that, to fund alternatives, it's hopeful. At the same time, we're missing a lot of details, and really critically, there have been no new interim measures announced along with this funding. And why that matters is because logging is an ongoing issue. There are old growth forests being cut down as we speak every day in BC. And without interim measures, temporary limits to keep those forests standing, there could be a lot of money made available to protect forests that won't be there in another couple of years once these plans are finalized. And that's where the government needs to do better.
And you sort of already mentioned this, but why is saving old growth trees so important?
Oh, there's a thousand reasons. Really, really quickly, they provide habitat for endangered species that younger forests, that replanted forests don't. They absorb and store more carbon. They're critical to First Nations cultures, to the ecotourism industry. They're just special, intact ecosystems that are growing scarcer and scarcer. The vast majority of old growth has been logged, and the old growth forests that remain standing should continue to do so that our kids and grandkids can enjoy them too.
Other organizations that work to protect old growth forests have called this announcement a victory. In your opinion, was this a victory?
This is a huge step forward, and it belongs to the tens of thousands of people that have taken to the streets, that have written to their MLAs, that have taken action and spoken up for old growth. The win will be when these forests are safeguarded and left standing forever. So I would call it a great step forward with a lot of potential, but we need to see the government continue to do more and put more pieces in place to make sure that these good promises that it's made can actually be kept. What
more could the provincial government do to help climate change and slow down the loss of old growth?
Yeah, the fight against climate change is twofold. We all know that we need to do more to reduce emissions and work towards zero emissions. The targets, both the mid and long-term targets that we currently have, are not strong enough, and the government's not doing enough to meet them. meeting our climate change targets means no new fossil fuel export projects, and we still see the government leaving the door open and approving new LNG projects in particular. That needs to end. And in addition to that, one of the largest sources of emissions is logging and the mismanagement of forests. So the oldest, most carbon-dense forests need to be set aside. We need interim measures to do that immediately through the deferral of all at-risk old-growth forests. And then we need continued investment building again on this great start of $300 million to make conservation the best economic option for First Nations and other communities.
Is there anything else you'd like to add?
No, just that, the government, Premier Eby in particular, they do seem to care. In the press conference announcing this money, Premier Eby talked about his emotional connection to big old trees. And they need to know that the lack of interim action is undermining these commitments, undermining these promises. And we need to see this money, these funding commitments backed up with on the ground measures.
Torrance, thank you for your time.
Thank you so much for having me.
That was Torrance Cost, National Campaign Director from the Wilderness Committee. That was our story for the day. Thank you to Nathan Cullen, Linda Cody, Ken Wu, and Torrance Cost for joining me today. I'm Laura McKenzie, host and producer of Midcoast Morning. Jesse Woodward is our executive producer, and Arby Frew is our technical advisor. You can sign up for CHOY's newsletter at choy.ca/subscribe for updates from our news department and more. Our theme song is First One by local Nanaimo band Waste Management. You can find more of the music on their Bandcamp. Support local artists by buying their music. If you have a story you'd like us to cover, email us at news@choy.ca.
Midcoast Morning would not be possible without the funding of the Community Radio Fund of Canada's Radio Meters program and listeners like you. Midcoast Morning is a project of CHOY's nonprofit newsroom. Support nonprofit journalism in Nanaimo and on the Salish Sea today by becoming a monthly sustaining donor at $5 or more per month. Support the program at choy.ca/donate. If you're already a supporter, record a voice memo telling others where you're listening from and why they too should support our work. After you're done, you can email it to us. Also, share the podcast with your friends. While Meta is blocking Canadian users from sharing news content on their Facebook feeds, you can still share our podcast directly with your friends via Facebook or Instagram Messenger. Finally, this program acknowledges and gives thanks to the Snuneymuxw First Nation as we broadcast and podcast from their traditional territory. Thanks for listening.